Hello, thanks for tuning in. I'm Alexandra.
And my name is Phat.
And we're from the Infrastructure Institute, a training, advisory, and interdisciplinary research hub at the University of Toronto's School of Cities. And we're filming this discussion at the site of our latest exhibition, Plus 2.0, Imagining the Future of City Building Together Through Creative Mixed Use, here in downtown Toronto at the Collision Gallery. So creative mixed-use buildings bring together public, private, and nonprofit uses in innovative and unexpected ways. So this series aims to delve into the process of constructing creative mixed-use buildings by meeting with individuals and groups who work in, with, and around creative mixed-use projects, with this conversation's primary focus on understanding the critical role of partnerships. So central to the concept of creative mixed use is a delicate balance between the expectations of private developers or private partners and the objectives of socially oriented organizations, all while striving to optimize social impact and benefit. So today, we're chatting with Chris, the founder of Paintbox Bistro, a social enterprise and the first certified B Corp caterer in Canada, that from 2012 to 2022 was located in the neighborhood of Regent Park in downtown Toronto. So we're going to get started, and welcome, Chris. Thank you for coming and joining us today. Can you tell us the story of how Paintbox Bistro came to be?
Hi, thank you for having me. Paintbox was realized as part of the revitalization of Regent Park and opened in 2012 as a 160-seat bistro and cafe and full-service catering operation.
Due to the pandemic, Paintbox had to pivot and reimagine itself in new ways to continue to fulfill its mission. Can you walk us through the various stages of evolution of Paintbox Bistro, from restaurant to caterer to the grocery startup?
Well, Paintbox was always a catering operation at its core, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of driving social enterprises, in terms of revenue models. But the pandemic, like every other restaurant and caterer, was closed with the lockdown that took place in March of 2020. So it was in one day, I had to lay off everybody and close the doors. I really thought that was the end of Paintbox. I was in a situation where we had booked events for catering, but we didn't have funding to continue on any level. I was introduced to somebody who was very interested in online grocery at the time, and online grocery was very awkward at the beginning of the pandemic, to say the least. The big players were often taking a week or more to fulfill orders, and sometimes not even fulfilling them. It was an opportunity for a couple of partnerships that we used to make it work. We turned Paintbox into an online grocery, and our killer angle was that one of the collaborators in this exercise was the founder of well.ca. So he had big connections in the world of tech and happened to know the president of Uber in the States. So with a couple of calls to Uber, we started off with a model where Uber would deliver the food that we made. The Uber drivers had never delivered food before. This was a first. But it meant that we could fulfill orders and have them delivered sometimes within 15 minutes. So it was a really great advantage. Unfortunately, about 2 or 3 weeks after this, Uber took over Corner Shop, or acquired Corner Shop, which was a South American-based online grocery operation. And so obviously we're immediately in competition with us and dropped us like a hot potato. So we continued, and as the pandemic progressed and the big players like Sobeys and Loblaws and so on were able to figure things out, we lost not just that advantage, but also very much at a disadvantage because of pricing. So Nibbly, which is what we call the online grocery, really had to go. It was no longer competitive. And so we switched the facilities to doing food for hunger relief, which was a big opportunity at that time. We did for some time over 5,000 meals a week out of our catering operation in partnership with, I think in all, about a dozen different charities. until the catering market started coming back. We ended up doing some great gigs. It really looked like we'd made it through the pandemic when the last lockdown came in January of 2021. And by that point, I literally could not continue. We had catering operations booked and postponed, but that didn't matter. It was unfortunately a financial burden that I could no longer bear.
Talking about the way that Paintbox has pivoted over the years, what makes Paintbox, or for us, what really attracted us to your project and what makes it so special is how it's rooted in community. And that's because Paintbox Bistro was actually started thanks to a community benefits agreement, or CBA for short. And considering your involvement with the Regent Park Social Development Plan Committee, could you elaborate on your collaboration and engagement within the community during that time?
Sure. So the social development plan is an essential component of the Regent Park revitalization. Was designed to provide resident input from the start of the project. Honestly, really didn't do very much after that until it was refreshed after about 10 years, at which point it became really pivotal to the success of the community and partnerships within that space. The social development plan was broken up into 4 pillars, which were safety, communications, community building, and safety. And I was actually co-chair of the community building working group at that time and up until the time that I left Regent Park. It was really an essential component because it brought together residents old and new, different demographics, vastly different demographics, from the people who had just bought themselves a condo to people who are in Ontario Works and had lived there for decades, and provided a means of communication and dialogue between residents.
Could you discuss the push and pull between developer priorities and the goals of running a social enterprise like Paintbox?
That's an interesting question. It's a very good question. And it's, the developers are a for-profit enterprise with the goal of selling condos. Social enterprise has a completely different goal, which is the training or support of the community. And the developer in this situation really holds all the cards. There's a great power imbalance in that the funding is dependent on the developer, and yet the social enterprise really has very little in the way of leverage, I guess, except in terms of some implied threat of bad publicity, because a lot of the incentive for developers outside of the legal incentive, for example, of community benefits agreement, a lot of the incentive is to make them look good and make them look socially minded, and it's kind of social washing, greenwashing.
Yeah.
And I'm not being cynical, it's just a fact of life. Certainly my experience working with the developer was that there was intent at the top to generate this kind of an outcome in the interest of selling condos, of course, but a lot of the infrastructure of the development company was not familiar with these priorities and not used to them. And it's really, people in whatever field they're working become experts in that field, and they become familiar with what the paradigms are, for example, to be a commercial landlord. Yeah. And I mean, the same thing applies in the kitchen. Chefs have a way of working, it's hard to change. Yeah, I'm a chef, this is why I brought that up. And so there is this natural kind of clash of priorities and difficulty of working together.
And I just want to maybe dive a bit deeper, because a lot of the projects, when we talk about creative mixed use, is you have like nonprofits or like socially kind of motivated organizations or groups working with like private partners and navigating some of those power dynamics, but then also navigating their own capacities in order to build something long term. And you said something really interesting where you said about, there's one part about like helping these organizations, get there, but also giving them the tools to help themselves, to keep growing. So any advice or tips that you have for them?
This is a huge issue. This happens in, I would say, most nonprofits. It's really, I'm working with one right now that's built a beautiful facility in conjunction with a very good resource center for women, actually, and everything is built and is in place, but I guess the kind of visionary leader with expertise is lacking. And how do you make that happen? It's a really good question, and I think it's really why I would push for kind of a hybrid model of social enterprise, where perhaps you can get funding for this social enterprise part of the operation, and yet have a viable commercial piece as well. And most nonprofits don't have a large income from outside the grant system or funding from government and so on. So I would really advocate for this kind of a hybrid for-profit / nonprofit or charity-based operation.
And I guess another question, just kind of building off of that, in terms of thinking about a nonprofit that is trying to pivot more towards that like social enterprise space, but like, you know, wanting to avoid losing their core mission as well. If there's any insights for them to keep in mind, especially when you're, you know, at the forefront of creating these projects, you're dealing with private partners and their own like, I guess, like pressures that they put on you. If there's anything for them to keep in mind to like stay true to their essential, the core of what they're trying to do.
It's not just pressure exerted by funding partners.
Yeah.
It's pressure exerted just by day-to-day challenges. And building Paintbox, I knew it was going to be a training center. I had background in training. I was a professor at George Brown Chef School. I really didn't know what it looked like, though. I started off with the idea of, let's hire professionals to supervise, and we'll hire people from the community to learn and to work. And it was a disaster because the professionals knew how to work in a traditional environment, but couldn't get their head around working in this kind of a social enterprise-based environment. Restaurants can be very noisy places with the chefs yelling out commands. It doesn't work very well when you're dealing with people that are living in a community with much violence. Just doesn't help at all and doesn't work. So in pretty short order, I lost those kind of professionals that I hired initially, and I thought we'd go for a model that was kind of a cooperative management model. And I was very interested way back in the 70s. This was a lively topic, and big companies were trying it. Volvo was assembling cars according to this cooperative management. Other big, manufacturing firms were trying this out as well. So I tried it out. And that is to say, everybody had a job. People's jobs would rotate, by the way. So you could be a bartender one day and a dishwasher the next.
Oh, wow.
I see.
Well, not really one day. It would be for several weeks. But at the same time, if you were doing your restaurant or catering-based function, you had to take on something that would normally be the purview of, say, a management function. So somebody was responsible for repair and maintenance of certain facilities. Somebody else was responsible for social media. And it was kind of, everybody got a little piece of managing. And I thought this was brilliant. It was really exciting. And then the cracks started to show. And so I started hiring people again from the restaurant and catering world, but not people coming from a management position. Bringing in a bartender who's a really good bartender to work next to somebody else, because that's how you become a really good bartender.
Yeah.
And the moment of revelation for me came when I hired a waiter, and she had been working at several hotels and restaurants in the city. Within a week, she increased the standard of service just immeasurably.
Wow.
Because there was a role model, kind of a peer mentor. And so this peer mentor kind of system is what we ended up going with ultimately. So for every person that was employed, who needed a leg up or a second chance, or was, from racialized community that was being beaten down upon, there was somebody who actually knew what they were doing and could work with them, like the buddy system. And so ultimately what we ended up with was about 50% of the staff were industry professionals, and about 50% of them were people hired mostly from the Regent Park community.
Yeah, I really like that hands-on, I guess, experiential learning experience, or experiential, capacity building experience. I think that mentorship piece that you're talking about is really special and really core, especially that, you're bringing in, it's not that like kind of hierarchy of, like you said, you're not just bringing in managers, you're bringing in people who are doing the role that you're doing.
Exactly.
And so that you can mirror and learn and shadow from the people who are doing the role that you're doing or you aspire to be doing. And like you said, in the example of that waitress who was able to improve the customer service that she was providing, or the organization was providing through, what she was seeing, that like, as you say, like seeing is believing. So there's only so much you can do without seeing it in front of you.
And by the way, her trajectory in the operation was, it turned out she'd gone to school for design.
Oh.
She was from the Dominican Republic, but she'd come to Toronto and studied design at George Brown. And really what she wanted to do was to be in design. So she ended up evolving into doing all of our design, our websites, all of our media-based things, and thereby realizing personal growth, as would any of the other perhaps people that had less of a head start.
Yeah, the partnerships and some of the struggles that come with that, but also the realities of you when you're building and you're running a project in a community and you're trying to like build their capacity. Like it's not a straightforward project. There's like a learning curve for both you, but also for the people that you're bringing in. And so I think that story of the trial and error, but then also finding that mentorship piece, and then ultimately that final growth piece of the waitress turning into the designer, and watching one individual. I think when we talk about like projects, we like big fancy things and we like big splashy like metrics, but that story of one person, throughout her like growing in her career, but also professionally, and what I'm hearing like implied in what you're saying is a sense of like confidence that was grown in order to go and take her career or life ultimately to another level, I think is really special.
We have a bunch of stories like that.
Yeah.
They're one of our initial hires, who at the time she was a single mom, but her kids had been taken away from her. Very sad. She had issues which, precluded other kind of employment. Anyway, she came to Paintbox as one of our trainees. And have you heard of the TV show Chopped?
Yeah.
Yeah, so she ended up winning Chopped. Yeah.
She.
And she was so proud. She ended up having business cards made, with her name and chef underneath it.
Oh, wow.
Chopped winner.
She wasn't really ever a chef. She was a cook, but she won Chopped, and she was up against like professional cooks and chefs.
Yeah.
So there were lots of great stories. I guess the downside of the social enterprise is the failures, and they were also, it was in Regent Park. There were many. I guess if I were to do it again, which I didn't elaborate on before, if I were to do it again, I would hire a social worker, because there were so many personal issues. I mean, everybody's got issues, but certainly at Paintbox, the employees had more issues than average. And they didn't always have great outcomes. In fact, they often were quite traumatic and tragic. But I think that was a missing piece, because what ended up happening was some of the staff became kind of like the social workers without any training. I would receive calls in the middle of the night with somebody whose brother had just been shot, and they were down on Cherry Beach with no shoes, and I had calls from the police where I had to identify bodies. There's a downside to all of this, to working in a neighborhood like that and having, dealing with people who have big issues. And I love them all, and that's one of my weaknesses, is I fall in love with my employees. But what was created at Paintbox, I think, was something very different than a normal enterprise, in that it ran on love. And I had this thought initially, and I thought, but it's really true. That was the motivator to all the staff. And for a long time, I thought this was just a fluke of chance that that you could end up with an operation like this. The other thing that was very notable about Paintbox was that we had such a diverse staff that really anybody walking in the front door of Paintbox could find somebody they could relate to on whatever level. And I would be interrogated about how did you end up with such diversity in your team? And I'm like, oh, it just happened. We hired people, they came, we hired them. But I think at the core of it all was this very different way of running a business, which was with love at the center of it. And I thought this was a one-off. But since then, I have met others who've had similar experiences in their businesses. And I think it's a great model.
I do too.
Me too.
I feel like it's so important to remember too. It's like behind all these like fancy terms and behind, social development and all these ideas of building in cities, it's at the end of the day, it's like, how do we take care of each other? Or,
Absolutely.
It's kind of comes down to, understanding that like we're all trying to do our best, and we're all kind of there to, we're just doing our thing. And I think there's such a lack of understanding of how much empathy and care can really bring folks together, and there's so much power in that I feel like often is overlooked.
And it continued.
Yeah.
I mean, we had one of my favorite stories was one of our initial hires, again, was 20 or 21 years old and born and grew up in Regent Park, lived in the worst building in Regent Park where all the teenagers were shot and so on. And anyway, she's ended up becoming very successful and very wealthy. She ended up making it in the real estate business ultimately. And yet, when we needed a catering driver at 5 a.m, years after she had left us, she was there. It was like, you need somebody to do a delivery? Call me. And it was true. We would call her, and she had a key, and I didn't have to worry about that order not going out. And so, there was some really great camaraderie and mutual support that I think has continued now, even with the former staff to this day.
I think, but getting emotional thinking about it. But that idea of like, centering, like what seems sort of like contradictory, but like a business kind of running on love, but like also cities running on care, which is ultimately what even this exhibition is really all about, trying to like mutual aid and support, and how do you build cities that aren't just for passing by, but how do you build cities and ultimately communities, which is what you did ultimately through Paintbox, but building communities where you want to stay and you want to grow and you give people a chance to evolve and throughout all the random issues or things that they've gone through to go on and do whatever it is they want to do. So that's really special.
Yeah, I like that. Cities that run on care.
Were there any points of tension between who you were serving through your social enterprise versus who, let's say, the private partners would like to have living in their condos?
Yep.
Short answer, yeah.
Done. One of our big challenges, basically throughout the history of Paintbox, but mostly for the initial few years, was that we were seen as, people thought we were a division of Daniels. They thought we were part of the developer. They thought we were owned by the developer. We never were. I owned Paintbox. But this was people had a lot of attitude about what had been done to their community. You got to realize Regent Park was a very tight-knit, almost village-like community before the revitalization came along. It was very isolated. There were people in my initial training of staff, there were people who had really never been outside of Regent Park. Toronto was not their thing. Scarborough was another country. and people knew each other, and people cared for each other, and all of a sudden the developer came in and started wrecking their homes, sending them elsewhere. It was very traumatic on many levels, and the developer was blamed for this, probably rightly, right? And so being seen as part of the developer was a big disadvantage for us for a long time. And until it was until I really got involved with the social development plan and the community building working group, people, like, that's when they started to realize that, no, Paintbox was something separate and Paintbox was a place for everybody. And it turned out that became the case, but it was really tough at the beginning. And it didn't help that it was, you know, this old white guy in charge, and I kind of looked like the president of the development company, and, you know, it just was, yeah, it was very, it was, people really, not only did they feel unwelcome, they felt angry, and so that was a big piece we had to overcome.
I think that's an interesting point, though, that you mentioned that you were part of the community building group, part of the social development, like planning committee. So I think there's something interesting there about, like, yeah, if you're going to be in the community, you need to be involved with or know what's going on, what the voices are, what the community is actually talking about, and involved in those processes to understand those dynamics. And I'm sure, from what I'm understanding, that's what helped open doors and open up people to what Paintbox is trying to do.
It was very gratifying to me when it started to open up.
Yeah.
At one point, there are a number of really awesome community leaders, unofficial, informal community leaders in Regent Park. At one point, I was calling one of them about something, and I forget what the call was about, but he said, "Oh, you're my only white friend." And I'm like, I just loved that. It was like I've been admitted into the club. Like, you know.
I like how he just calls, "You're my only friend."
So.
Oh my god. Yeah. Iconic. So with your experience, and I mean, obviously, like, you've had a lot of experience just like with these kind of projects, what recommendations would you offer to community organizations or social enterprises considering embarking on creative mixed-use projects? Specifically, how can they design their operational models to ensure long-term viability and effectively achieve their social objectives and avoid mission drift?
Well, I think funding is one big issue, and that doesn't just have to be external funding. There are sectors that are very profitable, and there are sectors that are very unprofitable, sectors that are labor-intensive and others that are not so much so. Paintbox was designed from the start to have a core revenue machine of catering. I had a great deal of experience in catering at the high end of the market, and that's actually a very lucrative business. I also had a fair amount of experience in restaurants, not lucrative. Restaurants, it's very tough, and at the best of times, to make a go of restaurant. So the catering was always designed to support the overall enterprise. Restaurant was necessary because in the context of the redevelopment, there was a strong commitment on the part of the developer to animate that corner and to animate it through a restaurant. So basically what I did is built out a huge catering kitchen, and that was really the core ongoing revenue machine for the business. So I think you need that. Obviously there are other sources of revenue. You mentioned the community benefits piece, which is part of an obligation which is taken on by developers in doing new projects. That actually was really useful in that I went into Paintbox and was not responsible for the cost of the build-out of the business. So that made a huge difference. There was no major investment required at the outset from me in order to do it. Another thing that's really essential in a successful social enterprise is is the expertise in that sector. So it's quite frequently people have a great idea to realize social good, and yet don't have the expertise to compete. And I've seen this with other social enterprise caterers, for example, where they don't really compete, they don't have the expertise to produce a product appropriate for the marketplace. So really, I think another key element is to have the expertise in whatever field you're working in to be able to compete at a broader level.
Looking forward, what has been one of the greatest sources of satisfaction for Paintbox, and in terms of its impact on the community?
Really, the biggest source of satisfaction is the impact on the community. It was, we were not always successful with every trainee we brought on board. We made lots of mistakes, but at the end of the day, we really were a hub for Regent Park. There was a comfort level on the part of residents of all stripes to come in. There was no intimidation or nervousness for anybody. Everybody was welcome, and ultimately everybody felt welcome in the space. It led to the use of the space for all kinds of neighborhood-led initiatives and to bringing together of residents of that community in a very big way. And for that, I'm still very happy and very proud and sad that it came to a halt, because it didn't have to, except for the COVID.
So if you had a second chance, to redo like Paintbox, what are the resources that would be more helpful to help sustain the project even further, do you think?
For a long time, I've seen a lot of the typical social enterprise model is not a for-profit model. It usually relies on either government funding or foundation money or some other kind of grant. So in order to be eligible for that kind of support, you need to be a nonprofit or a charity. I think that there are advantages to being a for-profit enterprise and some real disadvantages to being a nonprofit, but to do it again, I would definitely have at least part of the initiative in the position of being able to accept grant money and funding on those bases. That would make it a lot easier at the end of the day to cover all the costs.
Amazing. First of all, thank you so much again for all your insights, and also for spending some time with us here today at the Collision Gallery. We also want to say thank you so much to Quadreel for hosting us here at the Collision Gallery here in downtown Toronto. And please come check us out here at the Collision Gallery. And if you would like to learn more about different events coming up, please check out the infrastructureinstitute.ca website. Thank you so much.